Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, with our ongoing series on gender and education, today we are going to talk on paradigm of education since 1991, globalization and thereafter. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Whip. Dr. Shruti Whip is Assistant Professor in Department of History, PGDAV Evening College, University of Delhi. Dr. Whip's immense experience and her desire to give a lot to the students has always initiated her to give the lectures through live platform of CEC. Friends, if you wish to ask questions from Dr. Shruti Whip on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800 430. I repeat, our number is 1800 430. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Shruti Whip, and would request her to give us in-depth knowledge on today's topic. Hello, ma'am. Welcome to the lecture.
Hello, Geetika. Thanks a lot for this wonderful opportunity. And here I am once again discussing with all of you what globalization is all about and how it has come to impact education. And education, not only a particular sector of education, but both school education as well as higher education. So I welcome all of you to this series of lectures. This is definitely going to make the whole concept of liberalization and privatization of education clearer, while at the same time you will also get to know how this entire process of globalization that took off from 1985 onwards has come to have certain gender implications and how the lives of women have got impacted as a result of series of changes. So, before we proceed further, let us quickly just try to understand as to what globalization is all about. So, globalization can be described as a process whereby it is not only free movement of goods and services, but also free movement of labor. So, various factors of production are included in the process of globalization, and India entered into this phase of globalization from 1990s onwards. So, it is not as if globalization has been a current phenomenon which began 2 to 3 decades ago. In fact, if we take into consideration the historical journey of our country, then we would realize that we were always global partners, though the scale and the extent was different. It was definitely different from the present times, but then that depends on the contemporary mode of communication and transportation facilities available. So today globalization owes a lot to ICT and the way technology is changing. But even in the past, when we take into account the historical period, and even before that, when we take into account the Stone Age, then there is definitely some reference to the kind of trade that was going on, which one can emphatically talk about on the basis of a number of art objects or beads, etc., the various remnants of art that have been found both in the areas which are outside Indian subcontinent, as well as a number of objects from the other countries have been found in the Indian subcontinent, which attests to the fact that India was not as if living in an aloof civilization, but definitely there were trade linkages, there were economic linkages, which ultimately resulted in cultural exchange of ideas also. So therefore, there were economic factors. These were the economic factors, trade-related factors that were ultimately responsible for economic prosperity for a large section of Indian society. But then here again, there were ifs and buts, because the maximum benefit was being made out by the richer sections of society due to feudal elements that were prevalent. Then there are a number of references that are available to these trade networks and the cultural exchanges, for example, in Jatakas, as well as a number of other texts, and there are a number of evidences which are based on the availability of Indian articles abroad. So, for example, even for the Indus Valley civilization, one can talk about the beads of lapis lazuli that have been found, and a number of other objects that have been found in a number of places like Lothal, Sarkotda, etc., important Indus Valley civilization sites, which probably were not indigenous and they had been imported. So, all this said and done, one can definitely draw the inference that even for the proto-historic period, that is the Harappan civilization, these trade networks were very active, and along with the trade, the cultural and the political network also must have been quite active. And by the time of 6th and 5th century BCE, that is the second urbanization that one can talk of, that is by the time of Buddha and Mahavira, again there were some very important trade linkages that were being formulated, and Indian sailors would go to far off lands like Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Burma, the Philippines, Indonesia, Laos, etc., even Vietnam for that matter, and Sri Lanka in the south. And this was not only about trade but also spreading Buddhist knowledge, ideas and principles, and so much so that by the time of Mauryas, the policy of friendship with the world and also of spreading the idea of Buddhism, the philosophy of Buddhism, ensured that India was not living a life of aloofness. There were definitely international networks that were increasingly being relied upon by the state. Then if we come to the early centuries of the Christian era, so from the 1st century CE onwards, then a number of articles that became important as far as the trade was concerned were spices, perfumes, animals, then textiles, pottery, and particularly fine muslin, which was in great demand. Then also ivory objects, as well as sugar, rice, ghee and Indian iron for its purity and its authenticity, its hardness. All these were in great demand in the countries that lay beyond India's subcontinent. Then also there was a large scale trade in live animals, for example a number of birds etc. that were being used as pets by Roman ladies for their own entertainment, particularly parrots, and also a number of animals like buffaloes, tigers, lions, elephants, etc. for wild beast shows that were conducted regularly in Rome and other Roman provincial capitals. So therefore, the whole process of trade was only expanding with time, and there was no looking back in this entire process of developing global networks as far as trade was concerned. Then however, it is not to say that it was only India which was taking a pioneering role in trading on this path of international trade, as that was the trend in the contemporary times, and most of the countries were doing that, and India also was one such trading partner. Then coming to the Gupta period, again the trade with the Roman Empire definitely played a very important role in creating very active trading networks, and also in a kind of cultural interaction that was never ending. And in fact, India's international trade connections reached their peak at this time, and there was continuing of this trend even in the medieval and the the Mughal period, though there was a brief break in this trading pattern due to the decline of the Roman Empire. But nevertheless, trade never stopped, as even during the early medieval period, as recent researchers have shown that the regional centers of trade assumed a very important position. So even if the so-called Great Gupta Empire declined and the Roman Empire also declined, it is not to say that India's connections with the outside world came to an end, because these regional centers and the regional polity that was becoming much stronger from the early medieval period onwards, that is 9th, 10th centuries onwards, played a very important role in continuation of this trend of maintaining contacts with the outside world, not only for economic causes but also for cultural as well as political reasons, which is also implicit in a number of matrimonial alliances that were always happening from time immemorial. So now, having discussed India's past, let us now briefly refer to the period from after the decline of Mughal Empire and also the beginning of colonization, that is from 1757 onwards. So basically this entire period from 1757 to 1947 can be described as the colonial period. And again, it was during this period that India got connected with the outside world, with the capitalist world and with the capitalist mode of production as a much subordinate partner. In fact, hardly the use of the term partner would be wrong here, because it was not considered as one. It was only considered as a colony who had to kind of fulfill its role of a provider of very cheap raw material that could be appropriated by East India Company, and also a provider of market, market for large scale production that was going on in the British factories. And so therefore, India became a facilitator for the industrialization that had taken off in a big way in Britain from 18th century onwards. So therefore, this entire journey of 200 years, though India was brought in direct contact with the European countries, particularly with the Western Europe, but then it was only a partnership of exploitation. So therefore, when we talk about colonial legacy and change, then one has to keep in mind certain factors, like that the overall tendency was top-down regulation. So the colonial administration, as it was trying to bring about changes in administration and it was claiming to modernize India, nothing was being done on the ground level, as it was only the top-down regulations that kept on coming one after another. Then also everything was control oriented, and that too centralized control, because the colonial administration wanted to rule India with an iron hand, so that something like 1857 did not happen again. Then there was very little role for educationists in this overall system of colonialization, and also what was being promoted was the state managed expansion. And even this state managed expansion was riddled with the political and bureaucratic patronage. So bureaucratization of administration, of the trading practices, of the whole economic system became the hallmark of colonial administration. And of course, the real reason was to develop India as a colony and not as an equal partner or as an industrially developed nation. And this could very well be accomplished by imposing strict bureaucratic controls and a very rigid administrative paraphernalia. Then also one needs to take into account that how the overall system of administration was largely based on a very reduced community control. So therefore, there were top-down regulations while the community participation was kept to the minimum. Though there were some governor generals like Ripon who tried to encourage participatory administration and local self-government, but then that was just a freak kind of an attempt, and nothing seriously emerged out of it. Then also there were negative societal perceptions about education, partly because the new kind of education was English education, and it was way beyond reach of a large majority of Indians, and also because Indians were used to particular kind of education that was being handed out in tolls and pathshalas when the Britishers came. So instead of continuing the indigenous system of education, what Britishers tried to do was superimpose alien concepts of education, which kind of alienated Indians not only from their environment but also from their lifestyle, from their whole mode of production. And this superficial alienation as well as a top-down approach did not make education in the earlier phases of colonial administration very popular among Indians and particularly among women. A lot has been discussed about this as to what were the gendered implications of colonial education in many of my past lectures. So I shall not be going into detail of that aspect, but what needs to be taken into account is that women who were not faring very well in the indigenous system of education continued to fare badly in the colonial system of education also for a long time to come, because no specific initiatives and resource allocation was done for female education as late as till 1882. Now, having given you a brief background about different historical phases, now let us discuss the globalization period, that is post 1990s onwards, and how the sector of education has got impacted since this tendency began. So here the central focus has been laid on some kind of localization, and also there has been a shift from the welfare approach to marketization. So basically globalization as a process, it takes into consideration the usefulness of market principles, that is liberal ideology, marketization, and there most of the sectors are gradually weaned away from the welfare approach, and it is the market tendency that reigns supreme. The issue of profit and loss becomes of utmost importance while taking into account the working of major sectors of the country. And sadly, even education has fallen prey to this tendency. So now talking about the various dimensions of globalization, a process that started from 1990s onwards in India, one can talk about three basic dimensions of globalization. First being the economic and financial globalization, then the technological dimension, and thirdly the interdependence of flow of knowledge. So therefore, it is in the third dimension, the flow of knowledge, that education and education related policies and principles come into play. Then there have been many radical alternatives after globalization, and the most important alternative has been infrastructure development. So in this entire rush to develop infrastructure, a lot of focus began to be put on the basic education, on the primary education, and there were also shifts of attitudes and perceptions on education. The major shifts that came about were concerning the importance of decentralization. That is, everything cannot be done and conducted and implemented centrally. A lot of devolution of power needs to be taken care of, and this was introduced through VECs, BRCs and CRCs, that is village education committees. Then the entire process happened along with the decentralization in management. So therefore a number of changes came about in the way education was being perceived, in the way it was being managed, and now with greater focus on decentralization, the village and the talukas and the districts, they became very important focal points which had to be empowered so that local resources and local efforts could be depended upon, and both the quality as well as the quantity of education at primary level could be improved. So therefore there was a sudden emphasis and thrust, a shift away from too much focus on higher education to the focus on developing infrastructure at the lower level so as to provide a better stepping stone to creating a kind of a quality framework which would help in approaching the higher education in a better way. Then continuing with our discussion on the radical alternatives that emerged after globalization, one needs to talk in greater detail about changes in local self-government, that is basically empowering Panchayati Raj institutions, and for this a number of amendments, particularly 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments were introduced in 1992-93 onwards, and it was these amendments that greatly empowered the Panchayati Raj institutions. Then also there was a lot of focus on social mobilization, because unless and until the marginalized sections of society were brought into the fold of this local network of institutions that was being devised, nothing could have been achieved. Then also there was a lot of focus on funding through external agencies. So external funds started flowing, and for this DPEP and SSA, that is District Primary Education and Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, these became very important policy guidelines and also initiatives that were started both at the level of the local as well as at the district levels. Then there was another very important paradigm shift that emerged post 1990s was an increasing reliance on privatization of education. So therefore privatization of higher education since 1997 has started in a big way in India, and the trend is continuing, and there is no looking back in this also. Then also PPP mode of partnership and education, that is public private partnership, and this also has been in operation since 2003 when this model was given. It was shown a green flag, and it came to be adopted in a big way. Here again the idea was to incorporate the resources and resourcefulness of the private sector while at the same time maintaining the facade of the public sector, and this has not only resulted in quantitative expansion of the education sector, but it has again created some kind of a wedge between the haves and the have-nots, further widening the gap, because the welfare approach is sadly absent in this PPP model, because the emphasis is definitely on profit orientation. Then also from 2009 onwards, again there has been another shift in this overall paradigm of education, and that is the right-based approach to education that came about with the RTE Act in 2009, that is right to education, which became a part of a fundamental right which was earlier considered as part of the directive principles. So it is now obligatory on the part of the state, and it is the it is legally binding also on the part of the state to kind of provide free and compulsory education to all children till class 8th. So therefore, with this RTE coming about in 2009, education has become more as a matter of right rather than as a matter of privilege or only morally binding on the state. So the tendency of globalization that had started from 1885 onwards introduced gradually these very paradigm shifts in the overall perception of education, and the tendency has been continuing till date, and it will continue. It's going to continue for many more years to come with varying degree of pace, and one can also earmark different phases of globalization depending on the varying degrees. So for example, from 1985 to 1991 can be considered as the one phase where the basic principles of economy were being revised, and there was gradually a shift that was taking place from welfareism to marketization. Then from 1991 and to 1995, the second phase, and from 95 to 2005 can be described as the third phase. From 2005 onwards, the phase is still continuing. Now, having discussed these different phases of globalization, another interesting discussion that I would like to undertake would be as to what were the reasons that these changes had to be brought in. We all know that from post 1990s these changes were brought in, but it would make a sense to understand as to what was the ground reality, what had happened in 1980s, that Indian economy had to make this choice. So for now, I shall be taking a break and will resume the lecture soon. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this particular productive session. Friends, we will be back after a short break, so you're requested to be with us. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session where we are discussing on a paradigm of education since 1991, globalization and thereafter. This is the topic of discussion. In our previous session, we discussed a lot and we promised to be back, and so here we are. Friends, for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Vip. If you wish to ask questions from Dr. Shruti Vip on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800110430. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Shruti Vip, once again, and would request her to continue further. Hello, ma'am. Welcome back.
Thank you, Geetika. So basically, what we need to discuss is the structural adjustment practices that had to be taken recourse to in early 1990s or late 1980s in order to deal with a number of problems that India was facing at that time. So these structural adjustment practices basically means restructuring the way economy was functioning, restructuring the way various sectors of economy were being looked after and were functioning. So therefore, the economic crisis in India needs to be understood with a greater detail, and what you can understand as students of social science or students of education, and the way it is relevant to you is that how there were a number of political imbalances as well as economic crisis that the country was going through in 1980s, and a very important role in this entire procedure was played by the Gulf crisis. Now, due to this, India had to pay a much higher import bill for importing crude oil, and also at the same time there was a loss of export market. So both these tendencies were going hand in hand. On the one hand, a higher import bill, and on the other hand, loss of the export market, and this had a detrimental impact on both the international credits as well as it became very difficult for the Indian government to access the international market. So therefore, India was almost on the verge of bankruptcy, and it was on the verge of a near default in July 1991. So this was the background that forced the country to take a recourse to globalization and to toe the line that had been shown to them by the international agencies like World Bank and IMF. Then there was a widespread shortage of essential imported commodities due to the international crisis, and there was a cutback on industrial output, and all these changes had resulted in inflation. So inflation had become a major problem that had to be tackled with. Then a number of corrective steps had to be taken in order to restore international confidence and in order to reorient Indian economy in a positive way. So therefore, it was in this background that structural adjustment practices were introduced and the globalization started from 1991 onwards. Now this globalization, the first important step was that a series of loans were taken from IMF and World Bank to meet the exchange requirements so that the deficit could be taken care of. So once India fell into the clutches of taking loans, there was no looking back, because these loans were not given just like that. They were given on certain conditions. The loans were conditional, and India was forced to accept structural adjustment practices, that is SAPs, in return of taking these loans. And how these structural adjustment practices were to come? They were to come through a number of policy reforms that had to be introduced by the government in order to deal with the issue of financial imbalances, financial bankruptcy, and so that Indian economy could once again come on the right path. So therefore, once these loans were taken, then India had to accept all the conditions that had been laid down by the World Bank, by the IMF, and they demanded that structural adjustment practices must be followed. Now, the most important demand that was made on Indian government was the liberalization of foreign exchange. So basically, India had to open up its economy. So it had to follow open door policy, and there had to be a liberalization of foreign exchange. Then another issue was that of devaluation and increase of indirect taxes. Also, there had to be cuts in spending. This was a major issue of the World Bank, and before giving the loan, all these conditions had been laid down, that how is India going to repay back its loan, how is India going to come out of this debt trap unless and until there is a major cut in the spending. And how this cut in spending was to be brought about? This was to be brought about by giving up the welfare approach and by adopting the market principles that were going to function on the idea of demand and supply and also profit. So therefore, a major bottleneck that came up was that there had to be reduction in government expenditure, there had to be reduction in expenditure on the social sector, so there had to be cut on social sector, and also last but not the least, and something which is very relevant to all the students, that is cut on education. So Indian government had to drastically cut on social sector, on education post 1990s in order to implement structural adjustment practices, and these guidelines had been negotiated by the international bodies like IMF and World Bank in order to give loans to India. So therefore, it is very important to understand these basic ideas and principles of working of Indian economy post 1990s in order to highlight and in order to understand further implications of how this overall tendency has further widened the gap between the marginalized sections and the rich. So therefore, continuing with our discussion on the various aspects of globalization, there was not one particular aspect but a series of aspects. So for example, the most crucial of course was finance. So therefore, foreign credits availability had to be ensured. Then communication and information technology improvement. This again was a very important benchmark for any kind of global network to operate. Then international movement of people. This again was a very important development which was facilitated after 1990s, and India became a party to it. Then the formation of global societies, the whole concept of global village and India not being a power on its own, but as one of the partners of the overall capitalist world system of production became a reality. Then also linguistic, cultural and ideology convergence. So here again what came into account was an increasing reliance on international principles, international cultural levels, international language, increasing reliance on English, and also not being too fussy and specific about the local, but trying to adopt global ideas, global knowledge, global cultural standards, global way of entertainment, etc., and accepting everything with an open mind. So therefore, this linguistic, cultural and ideological openness became a benchmark, became a very important standpoint from post 1990s onwards in order to attract not only foreign capital but also to attract foreigners to come and settle in India and to take part in the production process or to guide the production process. Then also the world system of signs, images and brands, and it is here that marketization and liberalization came to exercise a complete domination, and the present malls are a complete replica of this, where you hardly get to see any Indian brand displaying its product or drawing the customers. Most of the brands are foreign brands, and they not only have a bigger clientele, but in fact they are now becoming popular in smaller towns also, where people aspire to buy such products rather than Indian brands. So therefore, the global agencies IMF and World Bank had their say, and all these changes were gradually introduced. Now globalization is a process that not only India has experienced, a number of countries have experienced that, and it would make sense to kind of assess where it was a success and what are the examples of the failure, so that we as a country can understand both the aspects and then devise our own policies in order to benefit and in order to save our population from further hardships. So, for example, if one talks about the strengths of globalization, there are a number of strengths. For example, the income increases. So, a number of countries experienced an increase in income. Then the resources from other sources also increase, because it is not only one particular public sector or government sector which is now generating the resources, but even the private sector is encouraged to take the initiative. Then thirdly, there is rise in human development because of emphasis on education, because of increasing reliance on developing education as well as the tertiary sector, that is the service sector, and then increasing reliance on high domestic savings. So therefore, all these can be described as the advantages of globalization in addition to a number of other advantages. Now, coming to the weaknesses of globalization, as a coin has both the sides, so similarly globalization also needs to be understood with that alternative perspective also, and that is that it has gradually reduced attendance in schools, and this again has been proven by the ground research, which has pointed out as to how there is now a far more greater rate of absence as well as dropout rate, and this has steadily increased in case of the girl child. Then secondly, the fees that has been introduced at primary level in a number of schools again acts as a deterrent, and particularly in the PPP model institutions, though, because most of the government schools hardly charge any fees, but the PPP model definitely is far more taxing for the students' families. Then third major problem is the skilled manpower migration. Due to opening up of the economy and due to increasing reliance on migration and movement of people, particularly skilled labor, what India has been experiencing is a steady brain drain. So instead of brain gain, what Indian economy has experienced over a period of time is the drain of human resources to the Western countries, European countries, America, etc. So therefore, while the government is investing so much on higher education, but this tendency towards migration has not come to an end, because the kind of infrastructure and facilities that are available in the developed world are still not available, and this kind of entices the youth, and their only dream is to migrate, to go and settle abroad. And then a very high opportunity cost that the government is bearing in not only educating but also in providing so many other facilities, and then at the end of it, when the time comes to enjoy the fruits of the labor, people just migrate to other countries. So this huge opportunity cost needs to be tackled. Then a number of other problems that continue to persist with globalization is that the private sector that has gradually emerged as a viable alternative has further widened the rift between both the marginalized sections on the one hand and the rich and the powerful sections on the other hand, and the investment on the traditional institutions has steadily declined, and in fact it is rather going waste. And also there has been a neglect of human values, so rather there has been a dehumanization of society as globalization has taken off, because it is more now a commodification that is supreme, and everyone is in the race of amassing wealth as well as commodities, and the whole idea of peaceful coexistence, or the whole idea of satisfaction, which was the very hallmark of Indian culture and society, is gradually giving way to rampant commodification. So these are some very important points that one needs to take into consideration. But on the other hand, there are some positive changes also that have occurred along with globalization, and one such positive change is decentralization and devolution of power to local authorities, local agencies, local bodies, and also development of information technology, which India had to take up in a big way after 1990s. Now, as far as the number of countries where the experience of globalization has been a failure, one can talk about countries of the sub-Saharan region like Zaire, then Mali, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Zambia, Peru, Madagascar, Ethiopia, etc. Whereas the countries where this experiment turned successful can be described as Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia. And in Asia, a number of countries who have gone through or are going through this phase of globalization, like India, Bangladesh, Philippines, Pakistan, China, it has been a mixed experience. Now, continuing our discussion on structural adjustment practices, or LPG. So basically, SAPs also can be described as LPG, or liberalization, privatization and globalization. So these three important trends that emerged post 1990s can be described as, highlighting the economic reforms policies that took off in a big way post 1990s. Now, what were the implications of these SAPs or LPGs, that is liberalization, privatization and globalization in India? First of all, there was an increasing demand for cost-effective programs. So this was the the favorite policy. This became the favorite policy of the government, and one has to underline this: the cost-effective programs. So what was most important now was no longer the socially responsive programs or the welfare measures for a large majority of poor people, but the cost effectiveness of a particular program. Then also the program for reduction of wastage, that also became very important, so as to bring about a judicious usage of limited resources. Then thirdly, an increase of professionalism to increase the productivity. So therefore, professionalism became the hallmark of all sectors of economy, and with this also came accountability. Then also improve the HRD to improve efficiency and reduce expenditure. So human resource development became a major initiative, became a major focus area post 1990s, so as to bring about far more efficiency, to bring an end to wastage, and also to reduce the overall expenditure. Then lastly, one can talk about the introduction of discriminatory fees, which again rather benefited very few sections of society and deprived the larger sections of society from making use of the welfare measures of the government. Now, continuing with the discussion on the globalization theory, again it cannot be stated that it was good or bad in totality. So it cannot be perceived in black and white, and there definitely have been shades of grey. So therefore, one needs to discuss the ways in which globalization has benefited and the way it has been bad for the economy and the society. So coming to the beneficial aspects, for whom it has been beneficial. It has been beneficial for the developed world, for the developed countries. Then it has been beneficial for the output or profit related industries, mode of production. Then it has been very beneficial for people with assets, with skills, with those who are educated. And also it has been very beneficial for professionals, for managerials, for skilled, technically skilled people, because they can call the shots and they get paid what they ask for. Then also it has been very beneficial for those sectors which are flexible, for those who are flexibly adjusting themselves to changing values, customs, tastes, ideas, etc. But for those who are more fixed in their ideas, it has rather proved to be very detrimental. Then it has been very beneficial to creditors, because creditors are always earning from their money. They are always investing and reinvesting, and the profit is being generated at every step. Then also it is very beneficial for those in private or in self-service, so basically self-employed. So all these are the various factors that one must be kept in mind while one is discussing how and for whom it has been good. Now, for whom it has been bad, or those who have not really benefited out of this LPG process, one can consider most of the developing countries in this. Then also employment is a major challenge in the globalization, in the globalized economy, because employment, if one considers the lack of employment, the problem of employment continues to exist, and it is only at a very basic level that some kind of employment is generated. But here also there is no permanency, and the contractualization in employment has created far more problems for the female staff as compared to the male staff. So the level of exploitation has increased manifold as a result of globalization, because LPG does not really believe in facilitating permanent employment. Then also it is bad for people without assets. So those who are the have-nots have no more social securities, because the governments have gradually withdrawn their support because of the mandate of the World Bank. So for now the poor are far more vulnerable as compared to the pre-globalization periods. Then also it is bad for wages, because here also there is hardly any standardization measure that is being followed in the developing world, and primarily this is the reason that most of the developed countries have shifted the production process to the developing or underdeveloped countries, where the wages are far lesser. And this also explains the mushrooming of so many call centers, back centers and back ends, where such cheap labor is available, and they are working for far more longer periods as compared to the labor in their home country, in the developed countries, because the labor laws over there are very rigid, and one has to pay through their nose to get work done. So therefore the developing country has started playing the role of provider of cheap labor at very low wages, and those who are ready to be exploited. Then also it is bad for people with few skills, because they are definitely not able to command the kind of wages and the kind of respect that they could have done otherwise if this LPG or SAPs had not been introduced. Then also it is bad for debtors, because debtors, once they fall in the vicious cycle, they not only end up losing their money, their hard-earned money, but also there is no going back, and they continue to remain in this vicious circle for most of their life cycle. Then also it is bad for those in public sphere, because the public sphere is gradually shrinking. So those who want to get government jobs, there are hardly any government jobs for that matter, and with the emergence of PPP model, this has further shrunk. Now also globalization is good for particular size of firms. So therefore it is good for large firms. Larger the firm, the more it will benefit out of LPG. Then again it is good for the stronger firms, the monopoly kind of organizations. Then the global markers are far more able to make use of the ideas and principles. Then also it is good for sellers of technology, or sellers of sophisticated products, sellers of luxury items, and also basically very good for global culture, for the global citizen, for men instead of women, and also it is good for businessmen. So while all these sectors or people, they benefit out of globalization, on the other hand it is detrimental to the existence of small firms, because globalization or privatization entails monopolization also, and therefore what is important is economies of scale to generate more and more profit. Then also it is bad for women and children due to the rising exploitative tendencies and because of declining social sector security due to lack of resources at the hand of the government. Then also it is bad for localization, local communities, local culture, because the local is gradually giving way to the global, and the global is slowly appropriating the uniqueness of Indian society, of the diversity of culture. So therefore there are particular brands, there are particular isms that are to be followed and to be championed. And basically it is bad for sellers of primary primary as well as manufactured goods, small scale manufactured goods, because here again the problem is that of standardization and economies of scale. Then also it is bad for local security as well as bad for democracy and rights, because it is the internationalism that is now calling the shots and trying to govern not only economy but also indirectly society, culture and polity. So having discussed these various paradigms of globalization and also kind of discussing how it has an impact on education, I shall now take a break and continue from here. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this productive session once again. And dear friends, we believe that you should write to us if you have any query or if you want to give your feedback at info.cec@nic.in. The lecture is going to be uploaded on YouTube soon. Keep watching us, keep writing us. We will be meeting again soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.